Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into narratives. So I want to ask you a question, Mark, and
Okay.
so I'm putting
You're putting me on the spot. You didn't tell me you were going to.
I am, yes, and I
Okay.
did this on
Go ahead.
purpose because I want to hear what you think. So,
Okay.
do you believe in absolute truth?
So in some cases, sure. I mean, like for instance, mathematics, I think is an
Okay.
absolute truth.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
But I think otherwise, it's a lot about perception. So I think you'd have to probably look at the context before you could decide, is that an absolute truth?
I agree with
Yeah.
that.
Do you have a more direct question about that?
No, that was pretty much it because as I've thought a lot about this episode that we're going to do this week, and you said perception, and that is really what we're getting into. And so there's this quote that I really like. It's truth is in the eyes of the beholder, which is a play on beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. To some people, beauty is a truth, right? And so, the example I often give is color, right? I mean, some people may look at that and say, well, that's blue. And someone else may say, no, that's cayenne. They're both right.
And I think this is true. Like with color, I think we actually, I don't know how they know this, but I think our perception is actually very different. But my blue is my blue, and your blue is your blue, but you probably perceive it in a different way.
Yeah.
And so, what I'm seeing if I'm looking at this thing that's green, I think it's really interesting that way. But as long as you brought this up, so let's put aside narrative just for a minute.
Okay.
I think we need to talk about memory.
Okay.
Because if you think about narrative, briefly, we'll go into more detail, but it's the stories that we tell ourselves about our lives and our experience, right? So I think in order to do that, you have to really have an understanding of memory. And I think I've talked about this a little bit on previous episodes, but this is the way I conceive of memory. And I think a lot of people have this misperception that our memory is almost like a
filing cabinet,
a camcorder. I don't know what or a movie camera. And it's not that way. And here's why I think there's that misperception is because I think the filter that really impacts our memory and how we construct memory, our filter is really emotional based. And so let's take, for example, you're in college, you're studying for a quiz this week. And so what you're really trying to memorize are facts, right? Your emotional filter is not very strong in that. Yep. And so it's easy for you to remember, this fact, this fact, this fact. And a lot of people have really good memories for facts. And so they think, if I have this good of memory for facts, then I'm in a situation, say, where there's high emotional content, that I'm going to be the same good camera recorder of that particular incident. And that's not true. Because I say this all the time to couples that, there are three of us in the session and we have an hour together on a certain day. And I said, if we came back together, 6 hours later, and we each talked about what we remember of the session, there are going to be a lot of differences in those memories. And it doesn't mean that, some of us are wrong. It's just we focused on different things. We remembered different things, and it went through our filter, because typically in a session, there's a high emotional filter going on. I think the other example that's pretty well known is witness statements. So if you have a whole group of people who say are witnessing some sort of event, say a murder or robbery out on the street, then, you're going to have so many different versions of what was going on. But yet everybody believes that I think we all believe our memories are better than they are. And that's actually pretty easily tested. And we tend to overrate our own memories. But I think it's important for people to understand that we construct memories. It's not about having a recorder in our head. And the higher the emotional content or what we're feeling emotionally in a certain event, then I was going to use the word distorted, but that's not quite right. But I think that has a tremendous influence on how we construct the memory of that particular event. That feeds into the narrative then, right?
Yes.
So we construct a narrative. It's based a lot on the emotional world that either we came from, so the past, what's going on, in the recent past, or even in the moment, and that colors our narrative. And so the narrative is the way we talk about our life experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
So,
pretty simple, but I think the concept is pretty simple.
yes. And so there was this story, and I don't know where my dad heard this from, but this is something that my dad explained to me about people who often it seems like they're a pathological liar over time, but really they're just reconstructing events and memories to better fit them. So
Mm-hmm.
here's this example that he gives. A man goes fishing with his family and they all catch a bunch of fish. And then maybe they all catch an equal amount of fish. And so when he first tells the story, he says, yeah, I caught this many fish and they caught this many fish and, so and so caught this many fish. Well, as he retells it, each time he retells it, he catches a little bit more fish. And he's retold this story so many times that by the end, he's caught all the fish.
Yeah.
But he actually believes that he caught all the fish.
Yeah.
And
He's
so,
changed the
which,
narrative.
yes, he's changed the narrative. And so it's just a really good example of how unreliable our memories can be,
Right. And
especially over time.
but I do think it's important to realize it's unreliable, I really believe, based on the emotional content of what's going on.
Yes. Right, exactly. I mean, so, you think of you gave the example of, somebody witnessing or witnesses in a
Mhm.
crime.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, imagine how different the memory is going to be for the person who is involved in the crime, maybe the victim of a crime. So
Yeah.
take, for example, a car accident.
Yeah.
Their perspective is going to be way different, right? And probably really exaggerated. In fact, I've been reading about this in class this week about memory and perspective. And so one of the things that they talked about is they showed a video of a car crash, two different groups of people. And in one group, they said, how fast were the cars going when the cars hit each other? And they would say, oh, probably about 20 miles an hour. And then the other
Mhm.
one, they would say, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And they would say 30 to 40 miles an hour. And in the group where they said 30 to 40 miles an hour, they said, do you remember seeing broken glass? And most of the participants said yes. But the group where they said hit, most of the participants said no.
See, and what that is such a great example because it's the emotional content of the word,
Yes.
smashed versus hit.
Yes.
We've had narrative as long as we've had language. I mean, if you think about thousands of years, people ago, people are sitting around the fire. So there's no written language at that, or no written word at that time, or no
Mm-hmm.
way to pass it on. And the only way you pass on history is to tell stories.
Yeah.
And so our history as a species of telling stories, I think, goes back as far as we've had language.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in a lot of ways, it's part of us. It's part of who we are, is the ability to tell stories. And so we tell stories about our lives. And I think just like you pointed out, the word. So you had this example of, was it smashed and hit?
Mm-hmm.
So different words. And I try and help clients, couples all the time understand that the words we use have meaning.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that. And so I'm trying to think of an example that Lindy and I had. We were having a conversation, she and I, about something, I can't remember what it was. And like 2 hours later, she described the conversation as being a bad conversation.
Okay.
And I went back and I said, well, wait a minute, because actually we were both calm. We both talked. Essentially, what she wanted to get to was the conversation did not have the outcome that she wanted.
Mm.
And in her mind, so she used the word bad.
Yeah.
And so think if you were more accurate and say, well, that conversation really didn't have the outcome that I wanted. That is a very different feeling or narrative than, yeah, Mark and I had this conversation. It was a bad conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So the narrative becomes important in some ways in the words that we use.
Yep.
So You can use these negative words to describe your life and experience, or you can use these positive words. And again, I think that a lot of the narrative, whether let's say it's positive, negative, or neutral, I think it has a lot to do with where you are emotionally in the world, but also your history, a lot of your history. I mean, if your experience in the world is one where, let's say, people have taken advantage of you throughout your life, then your narrative of where you are in the world and how people treat you will be colored by that experience. And so often narratives keep us stuck.
And well, the same thing can be true of if everyone in your family is very, very trusting, and then you go out into the world and you're very, very trusting, you're going to be very naive, and chances are you're going to get taken advantage of. And
sadly,
so,
yes.
Yeah, which is very unfortunate. And so one of the things that we wanted to get into is the fact that we get to determine our own narratives.
Yes.
So we can't control everything that happens to us, but we get to control how we react to it. And so I have a really good example of this, and that is Curtis. He has a pretty incredible story. So he grew up in poverty. He house hopped a lot. He had food insecurity, so he had food scarcity. He didn't always have enough to eat growing up. He didn't always have a place to live. At one point lived out of a car. He grew up in a very dysfunctional home, and he had a lot of instability as a child, and he had no good examples of what a healthy relationship looked like. So he made better choices. And so a lot of people get stuck in this narrative of I have all of these things that happen in my life. I have so many negative things. I had such a bad childhood. And they take that and they say, this is just my life. Well, he decided he wanted more. And so he achieved more. And now I will say that he didn't do everything perfectly, right? He didn't graduate high school, largely because he wanted to move out as soon as he turned 18. He wanted to get out and he couldn't support himself and do school. Like he had to work to support himself and do school at the same time, and he couldn't balance it. And so he dropped out of high school. So he did end up, now he served a religious mission for church for 2 years. And then he came home, got his GED, saved up enough money to go to college, and then basically took this huge chance, went to college, worked really, really hard, and got a good paying job. And he lives an incredible life for somebody who grew up in complete poverty. So, it just goes to show we get to determine our own narratives. Whatever happened in the past, don't discount that because it's important. And, and if Curtis had grown up differently, he might not have been as motivated as he is now. And so, it also goes to fixed versus growth mindset, right?
Yeah.
Curtis very much has a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset of I'm stuck because I didn't have enough resources as a child. He said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get the resources I need.
You're right. You're absolutely right that we can control the narrative. Let me give you another example. One, I think I'm seeing this gentleman tomorrow, and I've seen him in years past. So he had an event with this woman who's now his wife. But there's a lot of information that he didn't know at the time and still doesn't know. And so we really don't like that, I think, as a species, because we want to make sense of our life. And I think one of the reasons we create narratives is because it helps us make sense. And so if you're in a situation where maybe you don't have all the information, then essentially what you're going to have to do is make some assumptions.
Yeah.
So those assumptions may be right, they may be wrong. The assumptions that you use to create your narrative are going to be colored by the emotional content of your life and what's going on. And so he created this narrative that was fairly negative. And he's been holding on to that for quite a few years. And so part of our work is how to create or how to change the narrative. Now, some of that would be, maybe to get more information so that you can have, let's say, a more accurate narrative. But really, if you're presented with, let's say, in a certain situation, there may be 5 different scenarios that could explain what's going on. You get to decide which scenario you're going to go with. And a lot of people don't get that, and it doesn't seem right to them. And I think it goes back to this idea, well, this is my memory, so this is what's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And they get stuck in that idea that they can't change the narrative. And so the whole branch, I mean, I think we could call it narrative psychology, because there are certainly people, therapists out there who, I don't know, for the last 30 years, I think it's fairly recent, for narrative psychology. But the whole idea is to examine the narratives that we have in our lives, and then how do you change them to, I would say, more positive narratives so that you feel better about where you're going. And that it also changes how you behave in the future. So your example with Curtis is exactly what this is. And for whatever reason, however he did it, he changed his narrative.
Yes.
And it was just an internal process. And I think some people do that.
Mm-hmm.
But some people have a harder time and need help to, get the existing narrative out, look at the negative language, see how, you might be able to shift it. And somehow Curtis was able to do that all on his own. And it led him to a different life, because you could have someone else who had exactly the same upbringing who would still be stuck in that narrative.
Well, people are. You see it every day.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it all the time. People who grow up in poverty and, they don't go to college, or, or they don't do something to better themselves, and Curtis could have made different choices. I mean, because after he got home from his mission, he got a job making okay money, and he did okay supporting himself, and he could have just stayed there. And he could have kind of just lived at this level of, maybe doing okay, but he knew he wanted something more. He desired something greater. And so, and I'm not saying college is the only way to do that, because, I mean, there's certainly a lot of stock in trade schools, but the point is,
it was his path. It was his path.
Yeah, it was his path. But right. And so the point is, don't get stuck in a negative narrative. Change it.
Right. And I think people need to understand that, because what they get stuck in is somehow this is the truth.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to your question. Do I believe in, was it absolute truth? Is that the question?
Yeah.
And so I think maybe for most of our life, I don't think there is an absolute truth.
Yeah. Think of something really basic, such as the sky is blue, right? A lot of people, you're sitting here, you're kind of...
I know. Like some people would say, no, it's not.
Exactly. But I mean, everybody can look at the sky and say, no, the sky is blue. But then a scientist comes along and says, well, actually,
here's what, yeah.
And you know what? When there's a lot of clouds out, the sky is not blue. So again, it's not an absolute truth. So, I mean, view your life like that. Your life is not what it appears to be. Your life is not one color. You are not stuck on the color blue, or you are not stuck in the sky is blue. There's an explanation. There can be a greater explanation out there, and you can change your narrative. So let's shift gears to relationships, because I think this is important. And Mark, I know you see this a lot, and it's something that I've also been studying about this week in one of my classes. Is oftentimes, people get married usually because they're in love, right? Probably like 99 times out of 100, people get married for love. And so eventually they get divorced, or, some couples will get divorced. And a lot of times it comes down to their narrative, the narrative they've created in their relationship. And so it starts out positive, but over time you start shifting. I guess, and we've talked about this before, how when the relationship is new and it's exciting, you only see the best in each other. Well, that's going to wear off. And eventually the little quirks and those little annoyances are going to kind of start seeping in. And you're going to start seeing these negative things about your spouse. And at that point, you have a choice to make. You can either dwell on and focus on those negatives, or you can continue to focus more on the positives. And whichever one you choose to do is going to be the narrative you create in your relationship.
That's right. And so when I'm seeing a couple, this happens often, I'll give them a challenge. And it's usually not just the couple. It's if there are kids in the home, they do it with the kids. But I say, I want you to try and go a week or 2 weeks and only say positive things. And a lot of people have trouble with that, because they're so used to being in that negative mindset, especially with kids. Don't do that. Don't do this. You did that wrong, that type of thing. And so the challenge is to only say positive things. And for the families or the couples that do, it makes a tremendous difference because it shifts the way they feel about the relationship. And so I think, we've talked before about how our brain is really, it's evolved to focus on the negative because that's how we survived. So I think it's easy, for whatever reason, it's really easy to focus on the negative. I think it takes more effort to focus on the positive. And so I think that's why a lot of couples get into trouble, is it's just really easy to do that. And they forget all the positive reasons that they got together. Now, one of the things that I've seen to me is interesting is if a person, like a couple, and one of them gets to the point where they have decided they want a divorce, they almost always change the narrative to be negative, and they take positive events that, if you could get them both to step back, they would both say, 10 years ago, that was a really positive event. But in order to justify the divorce, what they do is they take it and make everything negative. Yeah. And I hear this often, oh, it's never been good. Or I've even heard this, oh, I was never really in love with her, which I don't believe for a second. I try to get them to understand that, there was something there, or you wouldn't have gotten married. But they changed the narrative to be a negative one. And so I think it's easy to go from positive to negative because of the reason I just explained. And I think it's harder to shift your focus into the positive, but I really think you can. And that's what most couples need.
Yes. And so I noticed myself doing this with Curtis, and I don't know that Curtis ever did with me, but I noticed this, and this was somewhere in between 2015 and 2018. And I know this because I specifically remember the house that we were living in when I started to have this shift. When my perspective about Curtis and about my marriage began to shift. And so one of the things that I'd started doing that couples in particular really need to be careful with is I started comparing Curtis to all of my friends' husbands. So, and I've told you this before, I lived in this really idyllic, amazing neighborhood where I had this other group of stay-at-home moms, and we would spend spring, summer, and fall pretty much all day. If it was a nice day, we were outside and we were all chatting all day, and our kids were running around. And so, and it was just amazing. And so we talked a lot, and we became a pretty close, tight-knit mom group. And so we talked a lot about our lives, and I would start to compare Curtis to other people. I would start to compare Curtis to my friend's husband. That is a big red flag if you start doing that. If you notice yourself starting to do that, you need to immediately stop it. Because I started to shift my narrative about him, and I started to think of all of the things that he wasn't doing that I wished he would. I would say, man, well, their husband does this and their husband does this. I wish Curtis would do that. That is really, really unhealthy. And I was creating this very negative narrative of Curtis. And so at that point, I had to make a choice. I had to choose to look at Curtis in a positive light. I had to choose to focus on the positive things that Curtis does, all of the things that I love about him. I had to make myself remember why I fell in love with him and why he is the one I chose and why I'm committed to him. And, that has worked out incredibly well for me. I can't speak to if Curtis ever went through this. I kind of think he maybe didn't, but I know I certainly did. And I think that's just something that couples need to be aware of, and especially newer couples. Eventually, you're going to fall into that trap, or at least there's a possibility you have to nip that in the butt right away.
Right. I agree with that. It reminds me of, this is why I really dislike social media. Because what happens is let's say you're looking at these other people's lives. And the first thing to understand, I don't know if a lot of people get this, is you aren't seeing the truth, whatever the truth is. I mean, you're seeing maybe a positive snapshot. You're seeing all the trips that, the couple went on, and all the times they're happy. But what happens is I think it leads a lot of people to create a more negative narrative about their own life because they aren't experiencing what they're seeing these other people experiencing on social media. And I really believe that the majority of what they're seeing is probably not accurate.
It's
That
not a full picture.
it's not a full picture, which makes it not accurate.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a pretty good example how looking at someone else, or as you brought up, comparing yourself to someone else, I don't think we ever have the full picture
Mm-hmm.
of that. And so it can lead us to create more negative narratives about our own life.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that happens if someone's working, say, narrative therapy, which I think a lot of therapists use, and they may not call it that. I certainly use it because what you're trying to do is get the person to examine, okay, what's the story you're telling yourself about this particular incident? Let's look at the words, because as I said earlier, words have meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And then you try and help them see, are there other possibilities for this particular event? And once they step back and look at it, they can see the other possibilities. And then you point out the problem, and I get that this is a problem, that they think if they're choosing the narrative, then somehow it's not right. And the one they developed is the one that's accurate.
Yeah.
That's the biggest hurdle to get over with people, is to help them understand that it doesn't matter what narrative they have, they're constructing the narrative.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so let's get into how to change your narrative, because you certainly can. And I also want to bring up the point that, in this podcast, maybe we're making it sound a little bit like it's easy to do, like it's easy to change your narrative. It's
It's
not.
hard.
It is hard.
Yeah.
And so, I tell the story of Curtis. It wasn't easy for him.
No.
It certainly was not easy. I mean, he worked really hard in college. And so, and the same thing is, if you're trying to shift your mental perspective or your mental narrative, that's going to take time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
it
it's a
does take time.
process.
Yeah, it's a process, but I think the first step is to realize how we create the narratives. And a lot of people don't understand that. So, if there's one takeaway today for our listeners, it's to realize we do create narratives. So if we
Hmm.
go to how you change that, and this is going to probably fit, pretty well with whatever Curtis's internal process was. But I think if you have a negative narrative, and it goes back to the words that we might use to describe ourselves that might be negative, like we have negative qualities, and
Hmm.
I'll pick one, for instance, that I've heard. Someone, maybe they grew up with a parent saying, "Oh, you're lazy this, you're lazy that," and that becomes the narrative,
Yeah.
right? And they see themselves as as lazy. I think it's one of the problems that a lot of children have in school, is they become labeled the troublemaker. This kid's the
Hmm.
troublemaker. And, however that starts, the kid is probably causing some trouble. But there may be all sorts of things behind that, something going on in the home, some sort of trauma or something like that. But he or she becomes labeled the troublemaker, and that's who he becomes. He
Hmm.
or she becomes as a troublemaker. So let's say you see yourself as lazy and you want to change it. So let's say the words or the qualities that might be the opposite of lazy. I'm hardworking.
Yeah.
I am determined and I follow through. And so you come up with these qualities that essentially, who do you want to be? Do you want to
Hmm.
be lazy? Most people don't want that
Yeah.
particular label attached to them. And I think a lot of people would want the label, oh, you're a hardworking person. So hardworking, you have to really decide, what does that mean behaviorally?
Hmm.
And so, you start with, what's the quality I want to have? I want to be hardworking, or want to follow through on the things that I say I'm going to do. I want to be dependable. So, maybe the opposite, one of the words that's kind of opposite of lazy might be dependable. And so you say, okay, what are all the behaviors that a dependable person has?
Hmm.
And this takes time. And a lot of people don't like to take the time, but essentially what you're doing is you're plotting out, this is my life, this is who I want to be. And so I think what you do is you create what I call a behavioral roadmap, where you can get up every day and you can look at your behavioral roadmap and you say, well, today I'm going to do this. And eventually what happens is you're changing your narrative.
Yeah.
I am going from I'm a lazy person too. Well, I'm really a dependable person. I'm a hardworking person. And you can do that.
And
But a lot of people get stuck in that negative concept of themselves.
And also, when you're going through this, expect to have setbacks. I think that's
Mhm.
another important thing is because people maybe, they get this idea of their head is like, okay, I'm going to change. And every day I'm going to start seeing improvements. Like, your example of lazy. Like, okay, well, every day I'm going to be a little less lazy. Well, you're still probably going
Yeah,
to have a day where you're really lazy, right?
right.
Or,
But okay, but the thing is, I would call it something else.
okay,
I'd
what would you
say
call it?
today I'm relaxing.
Okay,
Do you
sure.
see? And so the
Yeah.
words you use and how you define, like the opposite of lazy is not being busy, 24/7.
Yeah.
And so there are times when you can relax. And the word itself is very different because we see ourselves. I mean, essentially, if you say, well, I'm going to relax today, the unspoken context to that is I deserve to take a rest today because I've been working so hard,
Mm-hmm.
so it reinforces this idea of not being lazy. And so the other thing to remind our listeners of that we've talked about is that our brain gets wired by behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you see yourself as lazy, eventually your brain gets wired that way. The only way you can change the wiring in your brain is through behavior.
Yep.
And that's why I think, this thing I just outlined very briefly of that behavioral roadmap, to summarize for our listeners, is you come up with the quality that you want to have. I mean, these are going to be multiple qualities, but you
Mm-hmm.
pick one. And then the next step is to be really specific. I mean, very specific as you can be, the behaviors that define that quality. And then you start doing those behaviors. So it
Mm-hmm.
sounds simple, right? I mean, the concept is simple.
Yeah.
It's actually hard to
Yes.
do.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot of, self-reflection and thinking about how you think about yourself, the words you use about yourself, and then who do you want to be? How do you want
Yeah.
to change it? So I think
A-
that's how you go about changing it, is decide who you want to be. You are not stuck in
Yes.
those negative narratives.
And the same can be said for a relationship, for
Yeah.
your
Yes.
marriage. If you want to change the narrative of your relationship, the first thing you need to do is you need to start focusing on the positives of your partner, right? So that's a really good place to start. And I think another thing that you can do is if you're struggling in your relationship, and this is something that I've done myself that's worked really well, is if ever I'm feeling annoyed or I'm feeling frustrated with Curtis, or if I get into this, I guess you might call it keeping score. One
Hmm.
thing I do is I start focusing on all of the things that Curtis does for me. And so, and I start focusing on what can I do to help him. And it completely changes the narrative of a relationship because if you get so focused on what I need and what I'm not getting and what I want, then you're only going to think of all of the needs that your spouse isn't meeting or your partner isn't meeting. That's counterproductive. Whereas if you think of, okay, what can I do to better this relationship? How can
Hmm.
I improve this relationship? I think of this saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Hmm.
Well, a lot of people think that, they can just be this better person and the world is going to change. The reality is that it happens very slowly. So, be the change you want to see in your relationship, but don't expect it to happen overnight.
But that's the reason I love couples work, because if you look at I mean, I think a lot of us would agree that there are a lot of problems in the country and our world,
Mhm.
and you can't really do a lot about it.
Yeah.
You think about it. And so, what you can do is you can change the one relationship, which then changes the family. Those kids grow up and
Yep.
hopefully they, you know, have, productive, healthy families themselves. And so I think I mean, you can think about the global problems that we have, but you really have to act locally.
Mhm.
And you're right, it's slow.
Yeah.
It's a slow process. You just have to be patient.
My mom and I were just talking about this today. She was talking about her grandma who was an alcoholic, and then
Hmm.
she talked about how her mom did just a little bit better. And then my mom did better than my grandma did. And I'm doing better than my parents did. That's the way it works.
Right.
You know?
That's the way you hope it works.
Yes.
It doesn't always work that way. But
no.
That's ideally the way it works. Yeah.
Yeah. I certainly have a brother who's definitely not doing better than my parents did.
All right. I mean, my last couple of the day,
yeah.
The ending thing was you're going to change the dysfunction of your families of origin because you're going to do it differently. Yeah.
Yeah. So we get to create our own narrative. We're all our own authors.
And we get to change. Yeah, we get to change the negative ones.
Yeah, we get to change the negatives. You don't get to control everything that happens to you, but you get to control how you react, and you get to control
and how you think about it, and how you think about it.
Yes. Yeah. So that's, I guess, our challenge for the week is
be positive.
Think more positively about things this week. You know, do everything you can to put a positive spin on anything.
About yourself.
Too. About yourself. Yes. Yeah. Don't go trying changing other people because you can't change other people, but you can change yourself.
Can't do that.
All right. So next week, we are going to get into desire. And so we've talked about sexuality before on the podcast, but we're going to talk specifically about high desire versus low desire in a relationship. And we'll talk about why it can happen and how to handle it.
Well, it's pretty common. Other than fertility issues. Yeah. In sexuality, it's the most common issue for couples.
I think the top 2 causes of divorce are sex and money.
Yeah. Yep.
So, important topics.
Okay. All right. Have a good week, everyone.
We'll see y'all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.